All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. My name is Bob Nelson. I am the Chief Principal Support Executive, as I like to call myself, here at Brick Cave Media. And today we have a very special panel. Joining us as a special moderator for this panel is Pat King of the Poison Pen Bookstore. He moderates the science fiction and fantasy selections at the store. He will be hosting a panel of three of our authors today, and I'm going to go ahead and let him know that the show is his. And Pat, thank you for joining us, and go for it.
Thank you so much for having me. This is really exciting. And actually, it's not my show. It is the three authors who are here with us today. I just get the enjoyment of asking some really fun questions with our panelists. So I'd like to go ahead and have them make their introductions. If you could tell us a little bit about yourself, your books, your writing, and just let us know a little bit about who you are. Thank you for joining this panel.
Who wants to start?
First.
Why don't we start from the top, Joe?
So I am Joe Giunta. I go by J.A. Giunta on the books. I live in Fountain Hills, and I write mostly classical fantasy, I guess. I've done some urban fantasy. I've dabbled in sci-fi with short stories, but I usually stick with fantasy for novels. And I play a lot of video games.
Welcome. And right below Joe is Sharon.
Hi, my name is Sharon Skinner, and I live in Mesa, Arizona. And I am I'm a fantasy. I write spec fic, so speculative fiction. So it's fantasy, science fiction, some paranormal, some steampunk. I've been published from picture book on up, so I have a picture book out as well as my middle grade novels and my young adult and my adult novels. And I don't mean adult as in, that kind of adult. So, I'm excited to be here. I also am a book coach, a certified book coach. And so I help other authors bring their books into the world. So that's kind of exciting as well. And I'm just really happy to be here and be part of the Brick Cave family.
This is really exciting. And Bruce, welcome.
Thank you. I'm Bruce Davis. I write both science fiction and fantasy, lean more toward the hard science fiction side. And I like to think of much of my fantasy as alternate physics. There's definite rules that cannot be broken. In my day job, I'm actually a trauma surgeon. I work out of a level 1 trauma center up at Scottsdale Osborne. I live in Mesa.
Nice, welcome. Thank you so much. And I'm glad you're not, we're interviewing you during the middle of a surgery. You were able to take some time away from.
I'm actually in my office right now waiting for this patient.
So welcome, absolutely. So everybody writes from sort of a different spectrum of the science fiction fantasy genre. Bruce, you are really well known for your hard sci-fi. And then Joe and Sharon, both of you tend to write more of your traditional fantasy. So I've got to ask you guys, what drew you to writing speculative fiction, so to speak, writing in that science fiction or fantasy genre?
Well, for my part, it's because I get to make things up and I don't have to worry about the real world so much. I'm actually fairly careful to ground most of my science fiction in at least reasonably expected extrapolations of science. I have a little hand wavium here and there because it makes for better stories. But I don't write contemporary fiction because then I don't have to worry about the contemporary world. I can kind of set up my own social structure and let that play out rather than have to fit into something that I have to meet certain expectations or rules in. So that's part of it.
Nice.
For me, I started writing when I was very young. I've been an avid and voracious reader for many, many years, from the time I was 4 years old. And as soon as I could pick up a pencil, I started trying to write my own stories. And I would fill pages and pages and pages with all sorts of, you know, I'm sure they were terrible stories, but I loved them. They were exciting adventures about trolls that lived on the moon and things of that nature. And so that has just been something I always wanted to do. I always wanted to be a writer. And this is really the culmination, you know, being a published author is really the culmination of all of that for me. The reason that I come to fantasy and science fiction is, you know, much like Bruce, I like to make things up. I really like to make things up. And my day job's been as a technical writer where you don't get to do that. And so it's very freeing to put on that other hat and just make up all these wonderful, wonderful, just oddball things and build your own world and, you know, run through it and have a good time with it.
That's really cool.
I missed the question. Is it why do we write fantasy?
Yeah, what drew you to becoming a writer? What?
Oh, I became a writer because I started playing Dungeons and Dragons when I was like 11 years old, and I was a dungeon master, so I wrote all the campaigns and all the you know, the storylines that we did, and from there it was pretty easy just to convert that into novels.
Nice. So you always had an affinity towards writing and storytelling.
Yeah.
So Joe and Sharon, both of you tend to lean much more towards the fantasy and realm. In terms of that, you answered part of the question, Joe, in terms of getting started through Dungeons and Dragons, which is always a great place to start. So I'm really curious, what do you guys do to set up your worlds and your world building? And maybe you could describe the worlds within your current novels.
Oh, this is a fun question for Joe and I because we come at this very differently. So everything I do is very character driven. It's about the voices in my head. It's about the characters who kind of get inside my brain and need me to tell their story. And I end up following them around a bit like a journalist. I'm much more of a pantser traditionally than what you would, than a plotter. I lean very heavily toward I need to write my way in and discover it along with my characters. That's entertaining for me, but it's also how my process tends to work. Now, that doesn't mean that I don't then have to go back and work on plot to make an engaging story and to make it work. But I really, truly do come at it very much from character, and the world sort of opens up around the character as I walk with them through it.
I'm sort of the same way, but totally opposite. So I'll start with characters.
Just the same, only different.
Yeah, but I can't actually start writing until I've got notes on just what everything is. So I mean, I'll usually start with either an idea, a character, just something cool, and then I'll build around it. So I'll try to flesh out the geography, government, social structures, if there's races, a magic system. I need to have all that stuff before I start.
Yeah, and I run into it and go, oh, I have to have a forest here. What kind of trees would there be? What kind of animals might there be? Oh, I'll have to put a placeholder and then go do my research and come back and plug that in.
No placeholders.
No,
I'm
you
sort of
build a nice,
between-
you build a platform. You have a nice scaffolding that you build and then layer in all that stuff. But yeah, that's a very different process for me.
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't mean that there's not room to add stuff later. It
Right.
just means that I've got to have a solid footing before I can start.
You, Joe, do you really feel like you need to see the world before you can actually begin to write it, that you know?
Or at least the vicinity around whatever I'm centering the story on in the beginning. So if it's around a character, then I need to have everything in their daily life down.
Wow, it's quite a bit of work to get that. It's almost very Tolkien-esque in terms of what you're doing in terms of setting up your world.
That's probably why I don't write very often. Just I write fast. Once I start a book, I'm usually done in 3 months, but there's a long time between books.
A little bit of that maturation that needs to happen within the world and the
Yeah,
systems.
I'm just always thinking about it.
So, Bruce, with you, hard science fiction, a little bit different, but not entirely so. I mean, you are creating this world based off of rules and logic, just like a fantasy novel often is, but yours are, you know, a little bit more centered around science.
They try to be. I'm a little bit in between Sharon and Joe. I will come up with oftentimes a preliminary scene or character, something I want to see happen. Usually it's something that I would have liked to have read, but nobody has written it.
Exactly.
So I start it, and then I have to kind of figure out, well, how does this world work? And so, for instance, in some of my hard science fiction, the hand wavium is gravity control. But the logical extension of that is if you're controlling gravity, you don't need big engines sticking out the back of the ship. Makes no sense at all. You know, just generate a gravity field. And that kind of then informs the next steps in building the world about, okay, well, if that's no longer an issue, then low gravity planets are no longer an issue because you can make the gravity whatever you want it to be. Oh yeah, this makes a nifty weapon too. And so it all builds off of that kind of first idea about what's the MacGuffin that we have in this world that is different than what we know now. In my fantasy novels that I'm working on right now, I just took the, what if instead of an industrial revolution where it's really based on discovery of the basic laws of physics, if you think about how the Industrial Revolution happened, what if they discovered the laws of magic and had the magical revolution, and now they have the equivalent of a modern consumer society that just happens to be spell-based? And where do we go from there? So even my fantasy, like I said, follows these very specific rules. Only certain things can happen and only certain people can do them.
Well, you have to set up a structure, whether it's within science fiction or within fantasy. Otherwise, you come across all sorts of problems in terms of, you know, characters that are overpowered or, you know, plot holes because things don't quite make sense. You have to sort of adjust and come up with some rules based on whatever you're going to be putting within these novels. So I'm really curious, what are your rules? What are your most important rules in terms of creating these rules within your world?
For me,
unbelievable.
If I'm writing science fiction, it starts with doing my best to understand the physics or the geography of whatever I'm writing. And that gets into some really interesting research questions like, well, if you had a world that was nothing but an ocean, it would not be very inhabitable because there'd be nothing to slow the wind down.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I mean, you start looking at all kinds of stuff that takes you down research rabbit holes sometimes. But otherwise, the rule for me is very similar to, I think, what Sharon does, is I start with a character. And those characters are built in certain ways, and they're going to follow the rules of their own character. You're not going to have a character do something that just isn't something they would do. If I build a character who's, you know, a Boy Scout type, he's not going to go do evil things.
You don't have any of those.
No, we don't. No. If we have the morally ambiguous character, then there's a lot of room to play around with. You know, he might actually do something that most people would not consider acceptable. But the rules still have to be there. I try to avoid, even in my magical systems, things that are just kind of so outside the realm of what we would expect from a system of alternate physics. So if you think of magic as the manipulation of probability, you can't turn somebody into a toad. Okay, that kind of magic doesn't work. You can spontaneously set something on fire, but you can only do it from a certain distance away. That kind of stuff.
That's great. Sharon, how about you, Joe?
Joe?
I said, Sharon, how about you, Joe? For me, it's just being consistent. I mean, even if you have a set of fake rules, as long as you're consistent, you're not going to pull the reader out of the story.
Right. So yeah, so I have a character in my newest books, my newer book, Return to Anoria, which is a sequel to the Nellig Stones. And I have a character in there who is a tree mage. And this is a character who's part human, part tree. and she's also a sorceress, and she's but in order for her to do magic, she has to sink her feet into the earth and put out roots in order to practice her magic. So she can't practice magic over water. She can't practice magic over stone. She has to be in a place where she can actually get grounded. And that goes back to that whole Wiccan being grounded thing, and, you know, people who walk around barefoot trying to connect with the energy. And it just sort of made sense to me that if she's arboreal, if she's part tree, right? I think that's the word I want. But anyway, if she's part tree, then she needs to have some rules based around the kinds of magic that she can do. And so those are the kinds of rules that I like to set up for my characters. And it's important because you have to have those difficulties. It's like now that we have cell phones all the time, especially in middle grade and in young adult and kidlit, you know, if you set up a situation where you want to separate the kids in your stories, your protagonists are usually kids or young people, and you want to separate them from everybody else and isolate them and make life difficult, you have to break their cell phone or make sure that there's no signal, because otherwise they could just make a call and fix everything, right? It's the same thing in contemporary as it is in fantasy or any other or science fiction. You have to find ways to break things or cut people off from the source in order to make things difficult. And so you have to have those rules and stick to them.
Nice. In terms of that, what have you learned as time has gone on from your first book to your last book in terms of sort of what to do and what not to do? Have you found yourself noticing a change in terms of the rules that you've put down for your characters or within your plots? Something that maybe prevented you from writing yourself into a bit of a corner and having to try to figure that out?
I'd like to say I've learned that lesson. But I don't know how well I've learned it yet, although I do know that if I ever do another trilogy, that I'm going to have a much better idea of where it starts and ends all 3 books before I set out. Because with The Healer's Legacy, which is my best-selling book, I wrote the book and I was like, oh, I'll leave some threads open so I can write some stuff later. And I did not pull a Joe on that. I did not know where we were going next. And I really did write myself into a corner in the second book. So the third book was very difficult to write. I think I did a good job with it. I think that in the future, future Sharon will always write better than past Sharon. That's, you know, I'm a lifelong learner, and I teach the craft a lot, and I coach other writers. So I'm always learning as I go, because the more that you impart your knowledge, the more the more you deepen it for yourself, or at least that's how it works for me. And so future Sharon always writes better than past Sharon, and past Sharon did a pretty good job with those books, but future Sharon could do a much better job. And so that's the biggest lesson for me in that respect. But I still come at character the same way. I still find an interesting person who gets inside my head, and I just really, really, really want to go on a road trip with that person. And that's my approach to the writing, because I want the readers to want to get in the car and hang out with this person for the several hours or that it takes to get through an entire book with this character. I want them to be the kind of character that they don't have to be the nicest person, you know, but they have to be interesting enough that you don't want to get out at the first rest stop and say bye-bye.
Exactly. It's definitely hard to be with a character that you don't like, or if you decide that you don't like the character, oftentimes the reader won't like that character either. So that's really important, you know, as the story goes on, to make sure that that character is likable. We've gone through those books where you really don't connect with the character, and it doesn't ring quite as true.
If not likable, understandable. We have to at least understand why they do what they do. I think that this goes to a lot of, you know, the way Bruce draws his characters, because Bruce has the ability to write these ambiguous characters, morally ambiguous. That's how you like to say it. And it's so true. And yet we're fascinated by the characters and we don't hate them, but sometimes they're hard to love. You know what I mean?
Right.
Yeah.
I hope my protagonists aren't that hard to love. I like to make my villains very, very understandable. Like J.A., I might do that in the same circumstances. And that's how I try to approach it. I remember something Sharon told me, and it's been said many times in many ways, but when we were first getting to know each other, she pointed out that no one is the villain of their own story. And so, as long as you remember that when you're writing a bad guy, and if you understand the motivations, then the reader can relate to me and like them.
Yeah, it sounds like, Bruce, there was a little bit of a mic error there, so that we might have a little bit of a challenge understanding fully what you're seeing. Joe, it looks like was
Yeah, it sounds like you've got some kind of reverb going on.
yeah.
So anyway, for me, I don't think I would ever commit to a trilogy again. Now I prefer just doing one and done stories, and then if there's something more I want to do with it, then I can go back to it.
Is it was a trilogy hard? Did you feel like you were extending the story further than you wanted to, or was it just the preparation of creating something so big?
I knew exactly where I wanted to go from start to finish with the trilogy, but I kept getting pulled to want to do other stuff in between books, and it just felt like an obligation that I needed to finish the trilogy before I could do anything else. And I don't like that.
You have other things that you're wanting to do. In terms of that, that's unusual take though in fantasy to write a one and done. We see it so often in science fiction and fantasy, where they create an entire trilogy or duology or what have you. What is it about writing within just one book that really drives you to focus on that? And what are some of the challenges where we see like these extended stories? What do you think is the challenge of writing a fantasy that's just one novel?
Tying up loose ends all at once, just trying to fight that urge to leave all these little open things that could be mysterious, that are just going to infuriate the reader, that you didn't answer those questions.
So how do you prevent that? How do you prevent tying up the loose ends and keeping track of the different, all of your different plot threads? And that goes to everybody. I'm really curious because that's a challenge within these novels.
For me, I approach the book as a reader. I typically write what I want to read. And so when I'm doing my final edits, that I'm looking at it as a reader. Like, am I going to like this story? Did I leave anything open, unanswered, whatever? And a lot of that comes down to taking good notes, I think.
Well, so for me, it's about, if I'm doing, so I thought the Nellick Stones might be a single book, but I decided there was a second book, but it does stand alone very nicely. But I realized that there was another story that I wanted to tell, and I wanted to come at it more from Robbie's standpoint than Stephanie's. So when I went back to Anoria, in Return to Anoria, it's interesting because there are some questions that are still unanswered at the end of that book, but I don't plan to ever probably go back there. But if I do, if I have the urge, I can. But I left things open in Colors and Curses purposely because I'm planning a 3-book series there. And I'm working on the second one now. So for me, I don't write a lot of what I would consider, well, my picture book was standalone, although I was thinking of a sequel, right? I don't write a lot of standalone and the book that Joe and I co-wrote, Supernal Dawn, is actually not meant to be a standalone. It can. It's got that wonderful, almost 50s B movie ending to it that makes me smile when I read it because there's this whole what's going to happen next kind of thing. But and I know that Joe's got it laid out, and I just need to get back to it. But I've got these, but that comes back to what Joe was talking about, the obligation of finishing the other things. So I really need to finish these other things that I had already started when we were in that process. So someday we'll get back there. That's my hope, my intent.
Bruce, I don't know if we got your audio fixed. Oh, let's see here. We got you muted there. See if we can unmute you. No.
Is this any better?
Nope.
No.
No. So obviously it isn't.
If you go slower, it isn't as bad, but it's definitely.
I'm not really sure what the problem is. I'm
Are you on a
doing
PC
this on
or
my computer, and I'm not very fast with this stuff. So
Gotcha. If you're currently on a virtual network, that might be the challenge. Yeah.
and that'd be a problem.
So
Sorry.
no, that's okay. So in terms of latest projects, can you discuss your latest projects and what you're currently working on in terms of your books?
Well, I know Joe's going to say, well, I'm not doing anything, although he is probably sitting on something right now. But for me, we just finished putting out Return to Anoria, as I said before, which is the sequel to the Nellig Stones. And it's a middle grade. And we follow Robbie and Stephanie back to Anoria because now there are bigger problems than when they were there before. And things are not going well, and the land is sick, and a lot of things are not going well, and they now need to try and figure out how to fix it. But one of their allies, my sorceress, Laurel Silverbark, who's the tree mage, has actually tried to fix things. She sank her feet into the earth, as she does to do her magic, and became trapped there. And so now she's turning into a tree, and they can't even get help from her. So it's a whole thing. So that's it's a fun adventure. And it really is a story about understanding that people who don't always seem to be all there do have something to offer.
It's always exciting in terms of seeing a new book sort of come into fruition, especially one. It sounds like this one is sort of smack dab in the middle of the series, or are you planning to end the series on this book?
I never actually planned it to even be a series, but I had so many readers and so many parents asking if there was another book in this series, because for some reason, 10 and 11-year-old boys are very drawn to the Nellig Stones, and reluctant readers have become readers again because of that book. And so when I've been at festivals and things like that, I've had parents and kiddos come back to me and go, you know, my son wasn't reading at all, and now he's reading. What else have you got? And is there another book in the series? And I really want another adventure. And so that's kind of what drives me. It's not so much that I am planning to do a next book, but that I have readers who really want another book with those characters and in that world. And that's my driving force behind series typically. That's how Healers became a trilogy. I could have left Healers where it was, but people loved it so much they wanted more. And now I have people asking for collars, which to differentiate it, that's one of the few books where I did say, oh, I'm planning to do 3 books, right? I set out knowing that. But yeah, I wasn't planning a sequel. And now I'm writing the second book to Collars. And I'm also writing a middle grade steampunk because I just can't help myself. It's just a story that I have to tell.
Nice. What do you prefer writing for, children or for adults? Or that middle grade, I guess. Or is it just writing in general?
For me, it's just writing in general. I mean, The Healer's Legacy was originally written as a young adult, but I have a crossover audience of 11 to 84-year-olds, men and women, reading this series, which who knew that would happen, right? You can't plan for that.
Right.
But I also write other books that are for more of an adult audience. But most of what I do is picture book, middle grade, and young adult. It really is the majority of it.
You know, and it's so funny because I think there are a few books that I read when I was younger, like Susan Cooper's The Dark is Rising series, that I still revisit every few years. And you still are able to pull something out, even though those books were intended for a younger audience. It's sort of fascinating to read them as an adult and to pull something out. And it's sort of comfort food. I mean, Tolkien, the same way, when you think about it, he was writing for an adult audience, but he captured a younger reader as well. And I think that's really something special, and something that I think science fiction fantasy does so well is it captures that younger reader, maybe pulls them to read something a little bit more difficult, but they get something more out of it.
Well, and I think that's been true for a long time, because I was reading Heinlein when I was a teen, and Asimov and a lot of other things when I was a teen, a younger teen. And I read Tolkien when I was in fifth grade. So yes, I would say that it's pulled the younger people in very often. But what we found in the last decade or two is that young adult fantasy and became that that realm that adults didn't used to visit, because they thought, oh, it's written for kids. And then suddenly they started gravitating toward it and discovering that, oh, hey, these are really well written books. These are actually good. You know, Harry Potter, the first book in the Harry Potter series, is a middle grade.
Mm-hmm.
The series grows up as Harry grows up and became more of a young adult, and then a new adult really at the end. But readers from across all age groups were reading Harry Potter, right? Because it resonates.
Absolutely. And it really does. Joe, Bruce, do you feel like your books are geared towards any age really, or maybe of a certain age, maybe 12 and up, in terms of being able to read? Are you capturing that young adult audience along with the adult, or do you feel like your books are really geared towards adult up?
Is my editor.
It is
No,
not.
it's not.
Trying to be inclusive though. Sorry, Bruce.
Sorry. I may just bow out. I'm not sure what is wrong. That my books are aimed at the audience.
Yeah.
So I don't set out to write young adult. It's just a category it kind of falls into because of the age of the protagonist. So I tend to write stories that focus on young teen characters. I don't know why. I guess that's just easier.
Maybe it's because that's where we're stuck, Joe.
Could be.
Yeah, I'm willing to admit that that's where my emotional and mental state is pretty much kind of stuck a little bit, is in those years where I was that young adult.
Well, when you write an adult character, there's not a lot of room to grow. They're usually set in their ways. There's some, but it's not as easy as it is with a younger person.
See, I see Bruce shaking his head no. I think that you can have a character arc. So I'm going to go into coaching mode here. And I want to say, I really think that you can have a character arc at any age. And I think that we're discovering more and more of that. There are a lot more books out there now with women who are in their 40s and discovering new lives, or embarking upon new adventures, and middle-aged protagonists who are learning new things. We're not stuck. We don't have to be stuck as people, and I don't think characters need to be stuck either.
No, I was thinking of something more specific. Like when I'm creating a world and I'm going to send a character off into it, it's easier for me to show that world from the perspective of a younger person than it is from an adult who already knows that world, so that I have a reason to explain more. I don't know if that makes any sense.
It
And
does.
that's why I send my adventurers out into places they've never been before.
In terms of that, I mean, I can see where Joe's coming from, though, where if you have an adult who's, for instance, a grizzled warrior from a particular area and he's in that area, his output and outlook on that area is going to be much different from a teen who you might see go from being innocent to even a little jaded, right?
Yeah,
Or
well, that's true. And I see the point that it's a little bit easier to establish and show that character arc, but I don't think that, of course, I don't think that there's not a character arc capable. You know, I think the capability is there in any character. Depends on how they're drawn. Not every character in every book changes, though. I mean, there are books, especially thrillers and detective novels and things like that, where the character tends to stay the same book to book to book, and it's the case that changes. But even those, we're finding nowadays, a lot more of the more popular ones that I read, popular to me, the character grows or learns something about themselves or changes in some way over the course of the series, at least, if not over the course of a book.
Mhm.
Those are the ones I find the most engaging. So that's what I read.
So I am curious, what are you all reading right now? What sort of books are you reading in this time of COVID?
Well,
Currently,
I
I'm not
just
reading. Go ahead.
fine, Joe. What are you reading, Joe? Anything?
Well, I'm not in the middle of one right now, but typically I read like Raymond Feist, George R.R. Martin, Weiss and Hickman, stuff like that.
And Joe, what are you playing? Because I know that.
I'm between games, but there's a new season of Diablo in like a week.
Nice. So that's going to eat up some of your time, right? What character do you play as? Do you have a
Demon Hunter.
preferred class? Which one?
The Demon Hunter.
The Demon Hunter, which is always a lot of fun. I actually prefer playing as the monk. I enjoy
yeah.
that. I enjoy that class quite a bit. And yes, it is just about to come up. And it's amazing. There is a ton of storytelling nowadays within video games, and a lot more so than maybe when we were, playing as kids on the NES. It seems like it's evolved as the stories evolved or the systems have evolved. So good choice. I like that choice. Sharon, what are you reading? You seemed pretty.
Yeah, I read all the time. So the last few things that so the last book that I finished was The Notorious RBG, because I had not read it yet. And then I am currently reading The Huntress by Kate Quinn, which is about a woman who was a Nazi who has fled from Germany and she is now the prey rather than the hunter. And that's really, I love the structure of it because it goes back and forth between characters and in time. And then my next up on my list is a young adult called Show Me a Sign, which is contemporary fantasy. Or not contemporary fantasy, I'm sorry, historical fantasy.
Hey, Bruce, you have a comment in chat.
And Bruce, he's saying that he's reading a lot of mystery and procedural novels, such as Michael Connelly's Bosch series, which is an excellent series. You can't go wrong with a good grizzled protagonist within the LA Police Department. His new book just actually released this week, I believe. The 10th was the release date. I could be a week off, but without it right in front of me. And then you also read a lot of the Civil War biography nonfiction, and you go through a lot of character changes. It seems like, other than Joe, you guys read maybe more outside the genre. And is that so that your writing isn't influenced, or is it more just in reading interest in terms of?
For me, it's not about that. It's about being very eclectic in my reading. I'm very broad in my reading, and I'm always fascinated by what's coming out next and what kinds of books are being published and whatever tickles my fancy. I mean, Bruce will be happy to know that Murderbot is coming up on my list. I have it on in my stack. So we've had some good conversations about that. And I read a lot of young adult, a lot of middle grade. I've read this year alone somewhere around 60 books so far. Some of these selections, like the Notorious RBG, are come from a list called the Reading Women Challenge, which is a challenge that I complete every year. And it's a list of around 25 types of books that are written by women, about women. And so I want to finish that before the end of the year. And so one of the next books that's coming up on my list before the end of the year is also about women in the concentration camps. So I also read The Last Day of Summer this year, and I've read half a dozen middle grade fantasies. I just finished a really good middle grade fantasy by Rajani LaRocca called Midsummer's Mayhem, which is a mix-up of Indian mythology and Shakespeare's Midsummer Night's Dream and baking, and it's glorious. It's such a romp. But again, I read very, very broadly.
I mostly just read fantasy.
Yeah, as a science fiction fantasy selector over at a bookstore, I have to look at a lot of science fiction fantasy novels, but I read everything. And I enjoy it. You know, it's amazing. Some of my favorite books are ones that I've picked up that I never thought I'd really enjoy. I'm particularly fond of Ellie Griffiths, who writes a really wonderful series set in the Yorkshire area, and she's a forensic archaeologist, and really a lot of fun. Her second book was really ugly. It was not a pretty printing of the book. You know, they just didn't do a nice job on the cover. So I thought, well, I'm going to pick up something that, you know, just to see. And I was just blown away. And since then, they've reprinted the covers and they've done all sorts of things with their books, but they're really a lot of fun. Bruce mentions that he really enjoys the Murderbot series by Martha Wells, which is an excellent series. Of course, the Dresden Files, which the newest one just recently released. So he wrote 2 back-to-back that got released. And then Larry Correia, who, if the audience hasn't read, is a very funny science fiction fantasy author published by Baen. I do like the fact that he has the elves living in a trailer park, for instance. He's got a good sense of humor.
Well, you know, when it comes to, I just read a really good, really fun sci-fi called Space Opera. I don't know if you're familiar with this,
Cat
but
Valente?
it's basically Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy and then the Eurovision kind of smashed up. It's hysterical. And I don't get comedy on the page very well. So when you can make me laugh out loud, I think you've done something really, really good.
That's probably the hardest thing to write, I think, is a book that is primarily humorous, you know, and get that off the page without losing your readers. And I think she did a great job with that. Terry Pratchett, of course, a marvelous choice for that. In terms of, so we've talked about that. I did want to open up the questions to the audience. So if anybody has some questions, and I actually do have in my email a couple other questions from some readers, so I'm going to pull that up as well. But feel free. I think Cassandra Davis read everything but horror. Any cozy fantasy or sci-fi? Do you have any recommendations for those?
Well, Space Opera, I think, was pretty hysterical. I don't know if I call it cozy sci-fi. It just was fun. The best fantasy book I've read in a while was The Starless Sea by Erin. What's her last name? I can't think of her last name, but she also wrote The Night Circus.
Oh, Aaron Morgenstern.
Thank you, Erin Morgenstern. Yeah. So if you love deep fantasy that where the structure is a little bit different, I can highly recommend both of those to Cassandra.
I always would recommend Becky Chambers.
Oh gosh, I love Becky Chambers. Yeah.
So, yeah, if you're looking for cozy sort of, it's almost like Lake Wobegon Days meets in space, because it is very cozy. Nothing really happens, but it's more about the characters and the character interaction than anything else.
That's a great point. I love Becky Chambers, and I love her voice. She just writes so smoothly.
So I have some questions from David Stipes. He emailed me last night, and he really has a lot of interest in the writing process and getting published. You guys are all Arizona writers, and you're all with a local press. And I really admire that, because for years, the Poison Pen Press was its own small press. It's a couple years ago, it was bought by a larger publishing house. But I'm curious, what's that like being with a smaller publishing house? And do you have any recommendations for those who are wanting to get published?
I'll
What's
jump
it
in
like?
because
They all pick on you. It's terrible.
yeah, it's terrible. You know. Ha, ha, ha. It's a little bit, well, if you're with a small press that's like ours, it's a bit like being a part of a family. And so there is a little bit of sibling picking on one another that happens between Joe and I when we get together. And when Bruce and I get together on our podcasts, which, by the way, plug for the podcast this
Please.
Thursday, the 19th, we do banter pretty well. You know, there's that comfort. But I've been both traditionally with a bigger press published as well as with this smaller press. And I get a lot more attention at the small press. I get a lot more, and my books get a lot more attention. I get a lot more say in how things are presented. And that's something that you don't necessarily get with a big press, not unless they think that you're going to be the next Stephen King or whatever. And really, there's only one Stephen King. So that's what I would tell you about it. So you need to know what you want your publishing journey to be. If you really want that book to be published with a big press and hope that it'll take off, that's great, and go that route. If you want to be comfortable with that you're in for the long haul with your books, I would go with a mid-sized press like Brick Cave or a hybrid of that nature. And if you just want to get a book in the world, self-publishing, there's nothing wrong with it, as long as you write and have it edited well, get a good cover, put a really good product out into the world.
We've got a writer here, Judith Starkston, who's listening in, and she asked a question about the book that with the elves in the trailer park. That was Monster Hunter International, and she wrote a fabulous book called The Priestess of Ashana, so which we carry over at the Poison Pen, and it is a smaller publishing house. So you know, there's room in the world for the big press and the small press for certain. And I've seen a lot of authors get lost in those big presses, which is unfortunate, because they might be wonderful writers, but they only have so much money to market your book, if at all. And so it's a real challenge. You get writers who write fantastic books and get dropped after one or two books because it doesn't sell like what they're expecting it to.
So
Yeah,
is it okay to
I've
ask-
seen that happen. I'm sorry, go ahead.
So you're saying that the expectation or the popular assumption would be that a large press would have lots of money. And you're saying that a large press, because it costs money to run, also has higher expectations of what the book has to do in order to keep or maintain or keep printing more from the author.
I think the
Yeah.
average is they
Yes.
expect 10,000 sales on the first run.
Mhm.
And
You don't make
if
that.
they think, well, and if they think you're going to be the bestseller, they will put a lot behind you in the way of marketing and publicity. If they think you're going to be a mid-list author, they're going to let the book kind of fly out into the world with minimal support. If they think that, you know, we don't know, you might get bookmarks.
Mhm.
You know, it's, and you don't know going in unless you have an agent selling your book hard enough to get you the kind of big advance and the kind of big publicity package put into the contract. And that is just not standard for these days for a first time published author, unless they think you are going to be the very next big thing.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Right. Michael Connolly, huge amount of money goes into his marketing, right? Because he's a known quantity. So if you're me coming in, writing a new book, and I'm a new author, they're just not going to put in as much money, and they can't because they're riding on the fact that Michael Connolly's sales will end up keeping them high enough and up afloat so that they can publish the smaller writers. But then that sort of, you know, and eventually you get one or two people, 3 or 4 people who hit it really big for whatever reason within the zeitgeist. And I find most of those who really explode are because they're writing what they want to write, which is what all of you do. And I've got to applaud you for that. It's exciting because if you're writing the book that you want to write, naturally the book is just better. It flows better, it reads better. I think readers definitely approve and enjoy it. And Bruce is heading out. He's got to go save lives. Bruce, thank you very much, sir. You have a wonderful day. Thank you for joining. Sorry for the audio. So yeah,
Yeah, so to your point, Pat, you know, and who is it? I think it's a friend of mine down in Tucson who's also an author who says, she says, there's always room for awesome, right? So write the best book you possibly can. And there's always room in the market for awesome, whichever way you bring it to market or get it to market. As long as the product is something that, for me, I want every single book that I write to be a really good quality book so that people will come back and want to read the next book and the next book and the next book. I don't want to be a one-hit wonder, even if I could be a one-hit wonder, if I could, you know, say that I could do that and make it happen without, you know, magical thinking. So that's, I'm in it for the long haul.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's the best way to be, because eventually, you know, everybody builds those readerships, and I think that is how, when you have reasonable expectations, it's how you get a larger fan base. It's fun, but you write the books for you. You know, having readers is a plus, isn't it?
Yep.
Yeah, it's good to have, it's, you know, that's part of the problem with COVID is that, you know, I'm an introvert at heart, but I really miss the interactions with readers when they come around the corner at an event and they see you and they just get so excited because they love your book so much. And I'm not saying every single reader treats me like that, but the ones who do just make it all worthwhile, right?
Exactly.
So.
Can I
Well,
ask another question?
yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so if a larger press, let's say they want to run at least 10,000 copies to even think you're marginally successful. What about the mid-range presses? I understand you want to write the books for yourself because there's too much work to do it otherwise. I mean, it's got to be something you're really passionate about and want to love to do, I would think. But you also want to be able to have people read them. So, I mean, you want something, I would think, of some structure that allows people to hear about it, or marketing or merchandising or something. I mean, maybe there's a couple of questions in there, but I'm just still trying to figure out what is a reasonable expectation for a first-time author. And we're talking at this point about a fantasy, epic fantasy.
Well, Bob can probably answer this better than I can, but in my experience, it's the answer, and this is a consultant's answer, you're going to get it all the time. It depends. And so it's going to depend on the press. It's going to depend on your agreement with the press. It's going to depend on how much effort you can put behind it, as well as the press can and does. And then it's going to depend very much on what Pat talked about, the zeitgeist. I mean, who knew Grumpy Cat was going to take off? Nobody,
Right.
until it happened.
Yeah, and it's funny because I think the Poison Pen Press focused a lot on library sales. That was one of the things that they were looking for in terms of the new books, was getting them into libraries for them to read, and a lot of their hardcovers. So they would do a simultaneous hardcover and trade paperback printing, because libraries want hardcover, whereas another good portion of the readership prefers the trade paperback. So it's just sort of what the press's ideas are for what looks good. And being with a smaller press, you can have a lot more of an intimate conversation with the publisher on what that looks like, what the expectations are. And also one of the benefits too is, like Sharon said, it's more of a family structure. So numbers and things like that might be shared with you, whereas they won't be shared in a large press.
Yeah, I can barely read the statements for my picture book. I can barely read them. It's not that it bothers me. It's that understanding them is very difficult, and they come out so long past the actual quarter that they're for, that it's very difficult to understand them. But I get quarterly reports. We get quarterly reports from Brick Cave that give us some real substantial information, easy to read, and it makes it so that I know if something, I have a better idea if something's working for me.
Well, it is nice to have Bob local and be able to talk to him about these things.
Exactly. And that's one of the great things about having a place like Brick Cave Media here in the Valley, is that, for those who are local, I don't know why Arizona has such a large number of writers who live and work here, but we do. Apparently writers don't like to shovel snow. But we've got some really wonderful resources here in the Valley, and some really wonderful bookstores, not just the Poison Pen, but also Changing Hands, which is a wonderful local independent bookstore as well, where you're going to find things on our shelves that you're not going to be able to find elsewhere, big box stores, or really hard to find online for great books. And also, one of the benefits, I do have to say, if you're looking for good books or you're wanting to try to write something, it's a good idea to take a look, start reading other authors, or taking a look at what other authors are writing, and going to an independent bookstore and talk with the readers there, because those of us who work in independent bookstores, we're doing it for the love, not for the money, and we like to talk books. So we will talk books until you're sick of us. So
All right, I'm gonna actually interject a little bit and free poor Patrick. So I just wanted to say thank you to everybody for joining us today and joining Patrick King with the Poison Pen Bookstore. They are online at poisonedpen.com. And they have graciously set up a profile page for each of the authors that are guests today, to allow you the opportunity to order any of their books through the Poison Pen, which is a local independent bookstore and deserves your holiday support this year. So please make sure that you get over there and visit that site. And as Patrick was telling us right before we started, they've actually just recently reopened the doors. And if I remember right, isn't there a process to that, Patrick? Is it?
we just ask call ahead.
Yeah.
We're trying to keep it no more than 6 people in the store at a time, just so that everybody can social distance comfortably. We're independent. We're not huge. We're comfortable. We're a comfortable sized bookstore. So definitely just give us a call up beforehand just so that we can prepare for you. If not, we'll have you wait in the parking lot. Minute or two usually is at the longest anybody's ever had to wait. So we can just safely let people in and social distance and browse the shelves.
And of course, you are always welcome to reach out to them with a list so that they can prepare that list for you so that you can just jump in and
Absolutely.
get it.
And we are doing curbside pickup. So if you're not comfortable wanting to browse in the store at the moment, you can call us up and we'll hand deliver those books out to your car.
Cool. So Patch, thank you for being our moderator today. Thank you to our authors as guests, J.A. Giunta, Sharon Skinner, and the recently departed Bruce Davis. You will be able to watch this video online. We will post it to the Brick Cave Media YouTube page. We are also going to send a copy over to the Poison Pen so that they may edit whatever they would like out of it and do with as they please, as you will say. But certainly feel free again. Holiday shopping, Poison Pen Bookstore, check it out. So
Absolutely. Brick Cave Media.
thank you everybody for joining us today. Have a good rest of your day. We will have a poetry based webinar as well. The details on that will be coming out next week. So just follow us online, brickcavemedia.com.
Thank you
Bob.
all.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Well, thank you, Sharon. Thank you, Bruce. Take care.
And let me turn the record.